Since the earliest days of Magic the Gathering, card advantage has been one of the most important aspects of the game on a competitive level. The more cards one has access to, the more likely they are to be able to advance their board state as planned, as well as properly interact with their opponent. As such, cards that are drawn always have been at the forefront of power and playability. And given just how many good draw effects there are, many of the most powerful cards printed have been ones that specifically draw you more cards. So starting us off at number 10, we have Glimpse of Nature. This sorcery spell from Champions of Kamigawa costs 1 green mana. Its effect is that whenever you play a creature spell this turn, you draw a card. At face value, Glimpse of Nature may seem somewhat unassuming, especially considering there are several permanents that offer a similar effect for more than just a singular turn. In exchange for being temporary, however, Glimpse of Nature has a rather low mana value, which allows it to fill a very different niche than those slower permanents. Glimpse of Nature, instead, is most powerful when using decks full of low mana value creatures. Its most consistent home, Legacy Elves, runs several 1 mana value creatures that help generate mana. In particular, creatures like Wirewood Symbiote are not only cheap to cast, but actively have abilities that return creatures to the hand to recast them. These decks use Glimpse of Nature to draw several cards at once to dig for one of their finishers or whatever specific card they need at a given time. The card is also used in outright combo decks given its interaction with 0 mana value creatures like Ornithopter. In a deck with a high enough density of 0 mana creatures, Glimpse of Nature could potentially draw through an entire deck. This is especially true given the fact that a second copy of Glimpse of Nature could be cast on the same turn if drawn into to continue the combo. The card is so effective that it eventually was even banned in the modern format outright. It's only 10th on this list despite this, partly thanks to requiring other cards to really maximize its value. If you don't have any creatures at all in hand, Glimpse of Nature will draw no cards at all and essentially be worthless. Although, generally speaking, the decks that run Glimpse of Nature tend to be built to avoid that scenario. Regardless, the card requires more setup and has far more variance than most cards on this list. And then at number 9, we have Sylvan Library. Originally printed in this set Legends, Sylvan Library is an enchantment that costs 1 generic and 1 green mana. At the beginning of your draw step, it allows you to draw 2 additional cards. If you do so, you then choose 2 of those cards you drew. For each of those cards, you either pay for life or put the card back on top of your library. To sum up a somewhat convoluted effect in simpler terms, you can essentially look at the top 3 cards of your library, pick 1 to draw, and put the rest back, or pay life to draw those extra cards as well. There are some niche interactions the card has built around its somewhat roundabout wording, but beyond those corner case scenarios, the card is quite powerful while also not fitting green at all. The card is a break in green's established color identity, functioning more like a blue or black card than something that should be green. Phyrexian Arena is a similar card to Sylvan Library, which also saw competitive success, which draws a card in exchange for 1 life. Although Sylvan Library costs more life than Phyrexian Arena, it both can draw more cards and offers greater card selection. Sylvan Library is a card that would not get designed today, at least not as a mono green card. And beyond it being broken from a design standpoint, Sylvan Library is quite powerful as well. Even though the life cost can be quite steep, oftentimes in Legacy, where Sylvan Library sees the most play, it can be used alongside an effect that shuffles a library like the fetch lands, which are common in the format. If Sylvan Library shows mostly irrelevant cards, instead of paying 8 life to draw them and get them off the top of the deck, you can just crack a fetch lands instead to shuffle away those cards and put new ones on top for the next turn. It's also worth noting that Sylvan Library has seen a great deal of success in the Commander format, where their starting life total is 40 and allows players to more aggressively draw cards from Sylvan Library. From a gameplay perspective, Sylvan Library is perhaps the most fair card on this list with its steep life total cost. But its power, combined with just how unfitting it is as a green card, earns it its spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Frantic Search. This instant spell from Urza's Legacy costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana. It allows you to draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, which by itself would be a reasonable but not quite competitively viable spell. Compared to a card like Faithless Looting, which offers this for 1 mana, and one could assume Frantic Search is overcosted. However, Frantic Search also allows you to untap up to 3 lands as part of its effect as well. This means if you tapped 3 islands to cast Frantic Search, you can simply untap them and in practice, you've spent no mana to cast this spell at all. As long as you have 3 lands to tap mana with, Frantic Search is functionally free. Assuming you have a land that taps for more than 1 mana, you'll even be able to net extra mana from casting Frantic Search and have more available than before you cast the spell. This, coupled with the card selection offered by drawing 2, and the further graveyard setup that came with discarding 2 and Frantic Search, made Frantic Search an incredibly potent way to filter through the deck without sacrificing tempo. The primary reason this card is perhaps not higher is simply because it hasn't been legal in many competitive formats. The card was banned in Legacy before it was even called Legacy during the Type 1.5 format ban list announcement of 1999. And to this day, it remains on the ban list even as the format's name changed and new formats rose around it. Frantic Search would easily slot into various decks, supporting everything from Storm with the free spells to raise the storm count, to supercharging Dredge decks with graveyard fuel. Even Pauper format eventually banned the card in 2011. While this card has been banned as much, if not more than cards ahead on this list, because of this it also lacks the impact on the game, and is arguably still weaker than the cards ahead of it. So despite being banned for most of Magic's history, Frantic Search is only 8th on this list. And at number 7, we have Skullclamp. This equipment from Darksteel costs 1 generic mana and can be equipped to a creature for also 1 generic mana. The equipped creature gets +1 power and -1 toughness. Whenever the equipped creature dies, you draw 2 cards. This card was tweaked heavily in the design phases, and towards the end of design was changed to have the toughness reduction to help attempt at balancing the card. This was then printed without being properly tested, and only while testing the follow-up set did R&D realize just the sort of card they had printed. The toughness reduction only proved to break Skullclamp, as any creature with a single toughness could now be exchanged to draw 2 cards for a single mana. Skullclamp was used less as an equipment usually, and more as a repeatable sacrifice outlet for small creatures to help continue drawing through the deck. Squadron Hawk in particular was effective with the card due to providing several small bodies to feed to the clamp. But in practice games in both internal testing and eventually in standard, as the set finally came out, the meta devolved to Skullclamp decks and anti-Skullclamp decks. The card was quickly banned in Standard, a rarity at the time, and was on the ban list for Modern Legacy both from the very moment they became formats we know them as today. Most players these days will only have seen Skullclamp in the realm of Commander, where it's used in various combos or as draw engines in countless decks, primarily because the card isn't legal most anywhere else. This of course also limits the amount of competitive play it had, with all of its sanctioned playtime existing within a short window of 2004. Despite this relatively short life in the competitive world, Skullclamp has maintained a legacy as one of Magic's greatest design mistakes that slipped through the cracks. And at number 6, we have Brainstorm. Initially printed in Ice Age, Brainstorm is an instant spell that costs 1 blue mana. It draws 3 cards, but then you must put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library in any order. This essentially makes Brainstorm neutral in card advantage, as it nets 3 cards at a cost of 3 cards. Of course, the power comes in card selection. Even though you don't gain any raw card advantage, you have now seen 3 cards deeper into your deck to potentially find a relevant spell. There is the risk, of course, of all 3 cards on top of your deck being bad. Since you put 2 back, all you've really done is reveal to yourself the upcoming bad draws. However, as previously mentioned with Sylvan Library, effects that shuffle the library are quite effective at clearing irrelevant cards off the top. The previously mentioned fetch lands are more frequently paired alongside Brainstorm as a way to sculpt hands. If a player already has dead cards in hand, they can use Brainstorm to put those away, then use the fetch lands to hopefully draw something better. In this way, it's even better than Sylvan Library's similar effect, since Brainstorm can put any card in hand, not just cards it itself drew. Brainstorm has been a mainstay in the Legacy format since its inception, forming the backbone of the various blue decks of the format. In particular, it pairs well with the format's premier attacking threat, Delver of Secrets, since Brainstorm can stack the top of the deck to guarantee Delver of Secret flips. Brainstorm is such a potent card that it's even restricted in the Vintage format. Despite this being one of the all-time strongest blue spells in Magic, it's also fully legal in Pauper thanks to it being a common. However, it's not even the strongest common on this list. While Brainstorm is certainly potent, it has many scenarios where it's simply just okay or even outright banned. The front half of this list are cards so generally good that there's very few situations where they're not relevant and powerful for that given situation. So in comparison to those cards, Brainstorm does fall just a bit short. But that's not to undersell its power by any means. It's more to say just how powerful the next cards on this list are. And at number 5, we have Necropotence. This enchantment, first printed in Ice Age, costs 3 black mana. Its first effect is drawback, which forces you to skip your draw step outright. The card also has a further downside of exiling any card you discard from your hand. But in return for these rather steep downsides, you're able to, at any time, pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library face down. At the beginning of your next end step, you put that card into your hand. This, of course, can be repeated as many times as you'd like. Meaning that while you no longer have a draw step, you essentially can draw 1 card in exchange for 1 life, whenever you like. Of course, you're only able to put those cards in your hand at the end step, and whenever you discard to hand size, you're forced to exile those cards instead. But in practice, these prove to be small downsides in exchange for the sheer draw power the card afforded you. This was only exasperated in the early days with Dark Ritual, allowing for the card to be played as early as the first turn. Decks built around draining life from your opponent and drawing more cards in Necropotence quickly became the best decks in early Magic before Necropotence was swiftly banned from Type 1 format in 2000. Later, Wizards would attempt to rebalance the card with Yawgmoth's Bargain, an enchantment that had double the mana value, but was arguably broken enough that some could argue it deserves a spot on this list over Necropotence. However, without Necropotence, there would be no Yawgmoth's Bargain. And even though the 6-mana enchantment is quite absurd as well, the quickness with which some can cast and begin to overtake the game with Necropotence cannot be understated. While the card has seen very little in the way of constructed play due to being banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage to this very day, it is an early example of just how important it is to properly price card draw. Since if card draw, especially repeatable card draw, can be done for cheap enough price, then even the steepest downside sometimes won't be enough to prevent a card from being dominant. And at number 4, we have Treasure Cruise. This sorcery from Khan's Takir draws 3 cards for a cost of 7 generic mana and 1 blue mana. Although thanks to the keyword ability Delve, you rarely pay anywhere near that much mana for it. Delve allows you to exile cards from your graveyard, with each card exiled paying for 1 of the generic mana for the card cost. While it's somewhat uncommon to get Treasure Cruise to cost a single mana, in the late game, or with a deck built to fill the graveyard, it can certainly be done. And even without delving away 7 cards, even casting this for 2 or 3 mana is still quite good. The power of Treasure Cruise comes mainly in its flexible costs. Some decks would fill their graveyard rather quickly when churning through their deck and will exile away 7 cards and cast Treasure Cruise to simply keep the combo going. Even in a deck not built to abuse it, the general flow of play will allow the card to be cast within a few turns of play, and by the mid to late game the card should be fairly affordable. This of course led to basically every blue deck in sanctioned formats adopting it and similar powerful delve card dig through time. Decks simply load up an interaction and cheap threats and use Treasure Cruise to refill their hands when emptied and their graveyards were full of used spells. Wizards of the Coast quickly banned Treasure Cruise in Modern and Legacy, as well as restricting in Vintage, all in the same ban list update in 2015. The format skewed heavily towards these blue decks that they were forced to ban Treasure Cruise as it was the main centralizing element and was just too efficient of a source of card draw. While Treasure Cruise's cost on paper is high, in practice it is far too flexible and far too easy to cast to be allowed in competitive formats. As the ban list update itself said, sometimes a card drawing card can be too efficient. And at number 3, we have Timetwister. This card, initially from the very first set alpha, is a sorcery that costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana. It has the effect that each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into the library, and then draws 7 cards. This card is the 9th member of the Power 9, a group of the 9 strongest cards in the first set, and many consider them to still be the strongest cards of all time. Timetwister itself is quite strong, especially if you cast it with an otherwise empty hand, or with many cards in the graveyard you wish to get back. Timetwister in some ways resets the game. While the onboard cards and life totals don't change, the decks in a sense do reset, and both players are now once again equal in card advantage. Of course, the player who casts the Timetwister has the advantage, able to play whatever cards they like to advance their gameplay, or hold up interaction to counter the cards their opponent just drew. Timetwister is so powerful that cards attempting to find a balanced version of its effects have also found success in competitive play. Echoes of Eons in particular has found success in Legacy in recent years and has a mana value twice that of Timetwister if you're not casting it from the graveyard. Days Undoing has seen marginal play in some formats, even though it ends your turn immediately after casting it. Despite all this, Timetwister is only 3rd on this list, partly thanks to its symmetry and also thanks to most of its legacy coming in the form of other cards that were directly inspired by it. As a member of the Power 9, Timetwister is undeniable, and its effect is so powerful even strictly worse versions are played to this day. But there is one draw spell that's not even Power 9 that is arguably stronger than it. And at the number 2 spot, we have the spell Gush. This instant from Mercadian Mask costs 4 generic mana and 1 blue, and draws 2 cards. A draw spell that offers a worse rate than Divination is hardly appealing, but Gush is rarely ever cast for its actual mana cost. Instead, Gush also has an alternative casting cost of returning 2 islands you control to the owner's hand. Generally, bouncing lands back to hand is a bad move for tempo, but in exchange for 2 extra cards in hand, it was often worthwhile. This is especially true given the fact that lands did not have to be untapped, meaning they could be used earlier in the turn to cast a different spell, or even just used to float mana, then you would bounce them back with Gush. If you hadn't already played a land for turn either, and didn't have any in hand to play before casting Gush, while you do still go down on mana in the immediate, it does a good bit to assist in recovering the tempo. In fact, when you miss a land drop and then play Gush, by tapping your 2 lands first, then playing Gush, and removing one of those lands, you actually net 1 mana extra for that turn. And of course, this is just one use case of the card. In a combo-centric deck aiming to end the game in a single turn like Storm, keeping the lands on the battlefield is hardly important. The card also allows for control decks to play far more interactively against your opponent, holding up your mana to counter their spells if need be. If they wind up not paying anything to avoid your counter magic, you can cast Gush for its actual mana cost thanks to it being an instant. And of course, perhaps its most notorious interaction is with effects like Fastbound, which allow you to play multiple lands per turn. If you can make multiple land drops, then you've turned the downside of Gush into a complete upside, gaining more of a mana advantage without setting you back your actual land count. The play in theory around the card is so complex that an entire real-life book has been written entirely around strategies involving Gush. The card is restricted in Vintage and banned in every other sanctioned format it could be legal in for its power in a wide variety of scenarios. However, there is still one draw spell that stands above it. And the number 1 most broken card draw card is Ancestral Recall. This instant costs a single blue mana and lets you draw 3 cards, and is another member of the previously mentioned Power 9 from Alpha. This 1 mana value spell was designed to be part of the boon cycle, a collection of cards which provided 3 of something for 1 mana. While red got to deal 3 damage with Lightning Bolt and has been a playable spell from the boon cycle to this day, the blue entry was so ridiculously powerful that even at the time of its design it was known to be far and away stronger than its other fellow boons. It was the only member of the cycle printed at rare, and was only even allowed in the set at all because at the time Magic was not balanced for an actual competitive scene, and the only appropriate effect for the blue boon to have was drawing cards. As such, we have a card that is so far beyond rate that no card has ever come close to its power level. Practically every 1 mana spell that draws cards draws a single card. And even then, cards like Ponder have been banned in formats like Modern for being too powerful. The closest comparison Ancestral Recall has to a Modern legal card is Visions of Beyond, which is an instant that costs a single blue mana and draws 3 cards, but requires there to be a graveyard with at least 20 cards in it. This is a staggering number of cards that has limited the card to only be playable in niche mill decks, whereas Ancestral Recall simply can be cast on the first turn of the game if you so choose, without any repercussions beyond discarding to hand size. There's no room for discussing competitive balance or tournament play with Ancestral Recall, as it defies card balance on a level higher than even its fellow Power 9 member Timetwister. The only cards that can even come close to the sheer ridiculousness of Ancestral Recall are equally ridiculous cards like Contract from Below, a card which actively requires you to risk permanently losing a card to draw more cards than Ancestral Recall for the same mana value. While this list certainly has room for debate for many of its points, it's hard to argue that any card draw is half as powerful or broken as Ancestral Recall. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other broken draw spells you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave it as a comment down below.